Karen clutched the eviction notice, her knuckles whiter than her perfectly manicured lawn. Her entire body trembled with a potent cocktail of rage and disbelief. Evicted? From her own home. The home she'd meticulously maintained for 15 years. The very picture of suburban perfection. All because of a little misunderstanding. No. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. It all started, innocently enough, with the hose. Karen took pride in her lush, emerald green lawn, a stark contrast to her new neighbor's scraggly, weed-infested patch. It was an eyesore, an affront to her sensibilities, a blatant disregard for the HOA rules she held so dear. And every afternoon, like clockwork, that dreadful hose slithered across the pristine concrete, shamelessly drawing water from her outdoor faucet. She'd tried reasoning. "Excuse me, dear," Karen had chirped, her voice dripping with fox sweetness. "I couldn't help but notice you're using my water supply." The response was a dismissive shrug. "Water's water, right?" The woman had mumbled, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. That was it. That casual disregard for boundaries, for basic decency, ignited a fire in Karen's soul. Enough was enough. She'd warned the woman, politely at first, then with increasing firmness. She'd reported the infraction to the HOA, a detailed account complete with timestamps and photographic evidence. But nothing changed. The water theft continued, a silent middle finger aimed directly at Karen's authority. The eviction notice, however, was a blow she hadn't anticipated. Apparently, her meticulous documentation of the neighbor's water borrowing was misconstrued. They called it harassment, bullying. They said she was unhinged, obsessed. They even threatened to fine her if she didn't back down. Karen crumpled the paper, her face a mask of icy fury. Fine her? Evict her? They had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't over. Not even close. This was war, and Karen was just getting started. She grabbed her gardening gloves, a steely glint in her eye. It was time to teach them all a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And she knew just the thing, the sewage tank. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Karen, clad in her gardening gloves, surveyed her arsenal. She wasn't a naturally vindictive person, but this was justified. This was about principle. She found the heavy-duty hose hidden behind the shed, a relic from her husband's brief and messy foray into car repair. Perfect. It would be strong enough to withstand, well, everything. Her lips curved into a humorless smile. This was going to be good. It was surprisingly easy to locate the access point for the sewage tank. It was almost as if the universe itself was conspiring with her. With a grunt, Karen wrestled the manhole cover aside, the stench hitting her like a physical assault. She wrinkled her nose, momentarily regretting skipping her morning coffee. Focus, Karen. This was about justice, not olfactory pleasure. The hose seemed to slither across the lawn, an eager accomplice in her plan. With practiced ease, she secured one end of the outdoor faucet, her movements precise, almost surgical. The other end she lowered into the depths of the sewage tank, holding her breath to avoid the noxious fumes. A wave of dizziness hit her, and she steadied herself against the shed, her stomach churning. This was a lot, but there was no turning back now. As she walked back to the faucet, she could see her neighbor pottering around her sad little garden, a smug, oblivious look on her face. Perfect. Taking a deep breath, Karen grasped the faucet handle, her finger hovering over the on switch. This was it, the moment of truth. A surge of something close to excitement, dark and exhilarating, shot through her. But just as she was about to unleash her fragrant revenge, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the quiet afternoon. It was a sound filled with sheer terror, and it was coming from inside her own house. The scream, raw and primal, sliced through the quiet suburban air like a shattered window. It jolted Karen out of her vengeful reverie, the faucet handle still clutched in her hand. Panic seized her, sharp and cold. That was no ordinary scream. That was her daughter, Emily. Dropping the hose, she sprinted towards the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emily was home alone, recovering from a nasty bout of the flu. Karen had specifically warned her against leaving her room. The last thing she needed was for Emily to infect the entire school. Bursting through the front door, she was met with a scene of utter chaos. Furniture was overturned, picture frames askew, a lamp lay shattered on the floor. A trail of muddy footprints marred the pristine white carpet, leading towards Emily's room. Fear, icy and paralyzing, choked her. "Emily," she screamed, her voice cracking. A whimper, weak and terrified, came from the direction of her daughter's room. Relief washed over Karen, followed instantly by a surge of protectiveness so fierce it bordered on primal. Someone had been in her house. Someone had hurt her daughter. Rushing into the room, she found Emily huddled on the bed, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was clutching her phone, the screen cracked, but still illuminating her tear-stained face. "Mom," she cried, launching herself into Karen's arms. Holding her daughter tight, Karen felt a surge of relief mixed with icy rage. Who would dare do this? The HOA. Had they sent someone to intimidate her? This was a new low, even for them. "It's okay, honey," she soothed, stroking Emily's hair. "Mom's here. Tell me what happened." Emily, still trembling, pointed a shaking finger at the window. He climbed in through there. He said you were in trouble." The blood drained from Karen's face. There was a man in her house, and he knew about her project. This wasn't about the HOA anymore. This was something far more sinister. And then, a terrifying thought struck her. If he was still here. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Karen's anger. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the intruder. He knew. He knew about her plan, about the sewage. But how? Had he been watching her? Was he part of the HOA, sent to silence her? "Did you see him, Emily?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. "What did he look like?" Emily, still huddled in her mother's arms, shook her head, her body racked with sobs. "I didn't see his face," she whimpered. "He was wearing a mask and gloves. He had this weird smell, like sewage." Karen whispered, a chill crawling down her spine. Emily nodded, her eyes widening in fear. "Yes. How did you know?" Karen didn't answer. She didn't need to. The intruder's message was clear. "I know what you did. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a warning." Gently prying Emily's arms away, she grabbed her daughter's phone. It was still warm, the screen displaying a half-written text message, calling 9. He'd stopped her before she could call for help. "Stay here," Karen instructed, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone. You hear me?" Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Karen moved quickly, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had to get to the phone, call the police. But as she reached the doorway, a glint of metal caught her eye. A small silver object lay discarded on the floor, glinting ominously in the fading light. It was a scalpel, and it was covered in blood. Karen's breath hitched. The scalpel, gleaming cruelly under the dim light, wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Her eyes darted to Emily, huddled on the bed, a vision of vulnerability. This wasn't about the hose, about the HOA, about petty revenge anymore. This was about protecting her daughter from a dangerous, unhinged individual. Moving swiftly, silently, she crossed the room and pocketed the scalpel, her fingers closing around the cool metal. It was a strange comfort, a tangible piece of the puzzle, a weapon against the fear that threatened to consume her. She had to get help. But calling the police, that felt risky, too public. Who was this man? How deep did his knowledge go? Was he watching her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? No. She needed someone discreet, someone she could trust. Someone who understood the dark underbelly of suburbia, the secrets lurking beneath the manicured lawns and pristine facades. Bill. Bill wasn't just a neighborhood handyman. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia of everyone's dirty laundry. Divorces, affairs, shady business dealings. Bill knew it all. And more importantly, he owed Karen a favor. A big one. Snatching her phone from the nightstand, she quickly dialed his number, her fingers trembling slightly. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Bill, it's Karen from Maple Drive," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Karen, what's going on? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Bill," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "I need your help. It's about Emily. Someone was just here, in the house." Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "You don't want the cops sniffing around this, Karen," Bill said, his voice low and serious. "Not with everything else going on." He understood. Relief washed over her, chased by a new wave of dread. "I know, Bill, I know. That's why I called you. I need you here. Now." Bill arrived within minutes, a hulking figure silhouetted against the dying light. He moved with surprising agility for a man of his size, his face etched with concern. One look at Karen, her face pale and drawn, and he knew this was serious. "All right, Karen, let's take this inside," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You too, Emily, safe and sound." Emily, her eyes still wide with fear, allowed Bill to usher her into the living room. He settled her on the couch, draping a throw blanket over her trembling shoulders. Karen watched, a surge of gratitude washing over her. Bill might have his flaws, but he was good with kids. Always had been. "Start from the beginning, Karen," Bill said, settling into an armchair, his gaze steady and unwavering. "And don't leave anything out." And so, Karen told him everything. The hose, the sewage, the eviction notice, the intruder, the scalpel. She spoke in a low voice, her words tumbling over each other in their urgency. Bill listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask. When she was finished, he remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the cracked window pane. "You say this guy knew about the sewage situation?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. Karen nodded, her heart pounding. "He had to. It's the only explanation." Bill rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That narrows things down," he muttered, more to himself than to Karen. "Not many folks know about that little incident of yours." Karen's blood ran cold. Incident? Was that what he was calling it now? Attempted murder by sewage seemed a tad more accurate. "What are you saying, Bill?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think it's someone from the HOA?" Bill's eyes met hers, a glint of something unreadable in their depths. "Let's just say," he said slowly, "that you've made some powerful enemies lately, Karen. Enemies with long memories." A wave of nausea washed over Karen. Long memories. What did that even mean? Was Bill suggesting this went beyond the hose, beyond the HOA? Was there something else, something in her past, that had come back to haunt her? She searched her memory, her mind racing. She'd always been. Particular, yes. A stickler for the rules, perhaps. But she wasn't a monster. Was she? "Bill, what aren't you telling me?" she pressed, her voice tight with anxiety. "Who would do this?" Bill hesitated, his gaze flickering between Karen and Emily, who sat huddled on the couch, her eyes wide and watchful. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "All right, Karen, but you're not gonna like it," he said, his voice low. "You remember that zoning dispute you got into a few years back? The McGregors said you built your shed a foot too close to their property line." Karen frowned, the memory coming back in a rush of irritation. The McGregors. Horrible people. Loud, messy, their lawn a disgrace to the neighborhood. They'd thrown a raucous party every weekend, their music shaking her china, their laughter a personal affront. And yes, she might have exaggerated the encroachment of her shed. Just a tad. It was the principle of the matter. What about them? She asked, her voice wary. Word on the street is, their oldest boy, Mikey, he's back in town. Bill said, his eyes fixed on hers. Just got out of. Let's just say he had some time to think about things. About fairness. About people who wronged him. Karen felt a chill crawl down her spine. Mikey McGregor. She remembered him vaguely. A sullen teenager with a bad attitude and a worse haircut. But time, and whatever Bill wasn't saying, could change a person. But why? She stammered, her mind reeling. The zoning board ruled in my favor. It was years ago. Bill gave her a long, hard look. Mikey wasn't exactly known for his rational thinking, Karen, he said, his voice laced with warning. And some grudges, well, they fester. A terrifying thought struck Karen. If Mikey was responsible for the break-in, if he knew about the sewage, then he was more than just a disgruntled ex-neighbor. He was a threat. To her. And to Emily. Panic clawed at Karen's throat, choking her. Mikey McGregor, fueled by a years-old grudge and whatever twisted education he'd received in prison, was a clear and present danger. Her carefully manicured world, her sense of order and control, shattered into a million pieces. Bill, we have to do something, she said, her voice tight with urgency. He can't get away with this. Bill, his face grim, nodded curtly. I'll handle Mikey, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But you, Karen, you need to disappear for a while. Lay low. Let things cool down. Disappear? Leave her home? Karen's mind rebelled. This was her house, her sanctuary. She wouldn't be run out of her own life by some thug. But then, she looked at Emily, her face pale, her eyes filled with a terror that mirrored her own. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about protecting her daughter. Okay, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. Okay, we'll go. But what about... She gestured helplessly towards the house, towards the remnants of her life. Bill seemed to read her mind. Don't worry about any of that, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Just focus on you and Emily. I'll take care of everything else. He stood, his imposing figure filling the doorway. Now, pack a bag. Just the essentials. We need to move. As Karen hurried to obey, a million questions swirled in her mind. Where would they go? How long would they have to hide? Would they ever feel safe again? But one thing was certain, her life, like her pristine lawn, had just been irrevocably tainted. The sewage had seeped in, leaving an invisible stain, a stench she couldn't escape. And HOA Karen, the queen of order and control, was now living a nightmare of her own making. As they slipped out the back door, the last rays of the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Mikey McGregor was just the beginning. The question was, who would come for her next?